Hello. My name is Connor Power. This is my presentation on autonomy, free will, and ethics. Um, in this presentation, I'll try to provide an overview of the topic. I'll discuss just an overview of autonomy and how it relates to morality and that sort of stuff. And then I will discuss Taylor's reading and Ayer's reading and offer some of my own commentary on the two before discussing what I think is perhaps a better defense of free will, and that is multiple realizability, which is a position first outlined in philosophy of mind. And then I'll offer a conclusion of the topic as a whole. Okay, moral thinking as a whole. It's free will, its implication for morality. So we kind of need free will for there to be any sort of notion of moral responsibility, because um, if one is not free to make decisions, then we're not really justified in criticizing their actions. Like if we look to fiction, the idea of people being put under mind control and they're not in control of their actions is often used as a narrative device to like exempt these people from being wrong in their action, from moral responsibility. And I think this really illustrates how we think of free will as being necessary for morality. So like if you imagine a movie when someone's under mind control, it's like whatever their actions are, the audience gives them a free pass on those actions because they're not in control of them. So this illustrates how moral responsibility is necessary, or free will is a necessary prerequisite for moral responsibility. So libertarian free will is the idea that at least some human actions are freely chosen, that on a metaphysical level, people can act freely to some extent. So libertarians say, this isn't anything to do with political libertarianism, but they say that an action is only free if it is possible that the agent performing the action could have done otherwise. So if it was possible for something other than what did occur to occur, then an action is free. And okay, so this is juxtaposed with determinism, which is the belief that whatever happens was already destined to happen. It's determined by what happened, what came before. So there's no scope for free will. We can't choose what happens because it's already going to happen because of what's happened before. And this is obviously the Baron Dulbach, the famous quote, "Everything is in the inevitable result of what came before." That's a relation quote about determinism. So determinists believe that there's an unbroken causal chain stretching all the way back to the Big Bang, or before the Big Bang, if you believe this is just one of many universes. Determinists would be fans of Fleetwood Mac, maybe. They're never going to break. You can't break the chain of causal. That you can't break the causal chain, basically. That's it. Okay, so is it possible to reconcile determinism and free will? So many libertarians concede that the physical world is deterministic, so that no physical event can occur without being caused by some prior physical event. So if you're walking in the park and you see a football in the sky, you're not going to assume it just got there. There was someone kicked it and it went there. Like it didn't just end up. There's a physical reason that happened. However, libertarians contend that things with minds are capable of initiating chains of causality separate to the physical causal chain. But this idea is obviously a bit contested, because if one, like, causality does play a role in determining our actions. Like if I get up in the morning and I decide to have Weetabix instead of cornflakes, like I did this morning, um, that wasn't just a random choice. Like there was a cause for that, because obviously I felt like I knew I'd be recording and writing this all day, so I wanted the slow release energy. And Weetabix marketing campaign has drilled that into my head, that Weetabix is better for the slow release of energy. So obviously there's a cause behind that. And so to say that our decisions are people with minds initiate causal chains on their own would be effectively to imply that our decisions are random, which is probably a bit absurd. Uh, so then another argument for libertarianism is that we simply feel free and we shouldn't reject this. It's a really strong experience we have, so we shouldn't just reject this the potency of this and the strength of this belief. But on the other hand, if we look at determinism, why would we be different to everything else? Like if we accept that every single physical event in the universe, like the atoms that make up the sun or the atoms that make up me, you can trace a causal chain for how those atoms came to be here, back to the Big Bang. Like there's a chain of events that led those atoms to be here. So why would, if the atoms that make my brain there's a causal deterministic reason they came to end up here, why would I be any different? Like what makes my thoughts special? So why are we any different? So that's one argument for determinism. Okay, so this is I'm just going to talk about Taylor briefly first. So Taylor outlines two concepts in his reading. First is being contingency. So contingency is the belief that human actions are contingent, so they're not necessary. So imagine contingency plans, you make it but you hope not to use it, so not necessary. And so some human actions are not performed purely due to previous events. So Taylor believes that there are some non-causal explanations for certain human actions. And he writes that motivations and stuff aren't causal factors. They explain why events happen, but they don't cause them directly. But he doesn't really make a good distinction, in my opinion, between an explanation and a cause. They're kind of synonyms for each other, so he doesn't do enough to distinguish the two, in my opinion. So I'm not sure. I'll move on. So the second concept he outlines is agency. So Taylor thinks that a moral agent is someone who performs an action. That's what he defines an agent as. And he says that agents are distinct from their causal history. So he makes a distinction, and then he goes on to make a distinction between sufficient conditions for an action to occur and actually performing the action. So the causal history is what creates the conditions for an action to occur, and then the agent is the one who actually kind of gives it that final push and makes the action occur. So he says even if determinism is true, it merely sets up all the dominoes, and then the agent must push the first one to make the chain fall down. So the agent is separate from the causal history that has caused everything to line up like it has, but they have to actually go make the move to do something. So that's that's agency. So this point is further helped by this analogy where he asks us to imagine a person whose behavior is arranged, that it's like determined by spinning a roulette wheel. So it's a person that goes throughout their life, and you spin a roulette wheel, and whatever the roulette wheel lands on is completely random, and that determines what they do. So he says that there's no explanation for such a person's behavior. You can point to the roulette wheel and say, well, that's why they did it, but there isn't it's random. And yet he says, it's random. And there's something different about people, about agents, because we can look to them and say, oh, there's like an explanation, there's motivations there, that's why they did that thing. Whereas there's no such similar explanation for the random person. So there must be something different about agents. So I believe Taylor's hinting at something, or he's dancing around something, but he doesn't quite get there. But I'll return to Taylor with my discussion of multiple realizability. Okay, so Ayer, first off, he rejects this argument, the libertarian argument that the strength of our subjective experience of feeling free is a valid reason to believe in free will. So he says that from the fact that a man is unaware of the causes of his action does not follow that no such causes exist. So he thinks, it's a strong objection. He says that just because we're not aware of why or how we are determined, how our actions are determined, doesn't mean that they aren't determined. So it's a strong objection. It's a good objection, I think. So this Ayer discusses the extent of determinism. So he believes that a theoretically completed physics, neuroscience, whatever, would enable us to build a map of the causal factors that determine our every decisions. So the key word here is theoretical. So it may be that a completed science does not explain everything, and that would require Ayer to reconsider his position, because if science does not explain everything, there's some sort of explanatory gap, and maybe perhaps free will could fit in there. But to this point, science continually reduced the gaps in our knowledge. Think of the God of the gaps argument in philosophy of religion. in ancient times, people just probably assumed that the sun was just there and it had always been there. But now science explains the causal chain that led the sun to be there. So perhaps in another 5,000 years, people will look back with having completed physics or having completed psychology or whatever. People will look back and say, "Oh no, we can explain the reasoning behind everyone's actions, and why all those actions occur, just as we can now explain why the sun came to be there." And this enables us to. So this is why Ayer argues that determinism is probably likely. So, and then even if there is an explanatory gap when we've completed science, or if completing science proves to be beyond our capabilities, it's probably unlikely that this gap will be so big that we can justify moral responsibility, because that requires quite a lot of free will. Like, we have to be able to really make decisions in order to consider people morally responsible for their actions. So Ayer thinks that's unlikely, that there will be such a big gap. But anyway, but then the last bit of his piece, he does not outright reject moral responsibility, which is at odds with his thesis as a whole, in my opinion. I think he outlines a reductionist thesis, which is basically a philosophy that everything can be reduced, science, so sociology can be reduced to individual psychology, which can be reduced to biology, which can be reduced to chemistry, which can be reduced to physics, and then physics can be reduced to all the way back to the Big Bang, basically. The Big Bang determined what our physics are. So that's a reductionist view of the world, and I think Ayer is implicitly arguing for a reductionist position, even if he doesn't state it outright. And that seems, so his non-rejection of moral responsibility seems at odds with what he's written before, in my opinion. For example, on page 331, he writes, "What is meant by saying that the future course of events is already decided?" And then he goes on a little bit and he says, "It does not in the least entail that I am the helpless prisoner of fate." So this doesn't really make sense to me. He attempts to defend free will by saying it is only when a special sort of cause determines our actions that we are not free. And so he says a cause which strips our freedom, those special causes, are ones which constrain us, ones which compel us to do something. But I don't think he gives enough time to this idea. I'm not convinced by it. I think the point Ayer is attempting to make is maybe a strong one, but because he seems to outline a reductionist view of the universe before in his earlier writing, I don't really think this makes sense as a thesis. So he's almost like the philosopher in the Taylor reading who believes a set of premises, believes the arguments for those premises, but refuses to reject the necessary conclusion that follows. In my opinion, I don't think his argument. I think his argument is strong, but then the objection he voices to defend free will, I don't think he gives enough time to make it a good objection. So this is my own view of the defense of free will. I think you can draft in the multiple realizability theory from philosophy of mind. You could perhaps make it a better defense of free will. So multiple realizability is an argument originally conceived by Hilary Putnam, which states that mental states are realizable by multiple physical states. So if we can imagine the feeling of pain, Putnam says yes, that this feeling of pain is realizable by various different physical states. So an alien, so the reason he makes this argument is that it seems absurd to believe that every conceivable being that could feel pain, so aliens, really advanced AI, must all have the same brain as us. So he says that you can't reduce the mental state of pain to a physical state of specific brain neurotransmitters or chemicals firing, because that's preposterous, because we wouldn't imagine an AI to have the same meat-based brain as us. That it would probably be made of silicon, and if it's a silicon brain, it's not a meat-based brain, and then so therefore different physical states can both realize the state of pain, is essentially the argument. And this is a dualist philosophy, so it necessarily requires one to adopt a dualist philosophy, that there are some non-mental facts about the universe that are not explainable in physical terms. So because not everything about the universe can be explained in physical terms. So there are certain mental states that can't be purely explained in terms of physical brain states, because they can also be realized by different physical brain states. Then there must be some sort of mental realm separate to the physical. So that's why it requires a dualist philosophy. So how does this relate to Ayer and Taylor? So MR obviously rejects Ayer's reductionism, as not everything can be reduced to physics, and by extension the one initiating event about reductionism. So even with the completed physics or science as a whole, we can't account for these mental states because they're not reducible to brain states. There's some separate realm that they're a part of. So therefore there's some explanatory gap in a completed physics. So there are things outside the deterministic physical causal chain. And this leaves some room for free will. So the mental realm is not wholly separate from the physical. They're related in some way, because we grant that that our physical states are necessary to realize mental states. There's some link between the two, but just that the physical is not wholly deterministic of the mental. So there are facts separate from our physical reality about the universe. And I think this is what Taylor is trying to get at with his comparison of agents and random behavior. So he says that agents are explainable, or agents' actions are explainable, and you can explain. And I think he's pointing at the fact that beings with minds, their actions are explainable in terms of mental facts about their motivations and stuff, whereas the fact that the atoms that make up this pen lid came to be here, there's no reason for that. It just happened. You can explain how it happened, but you can't explain why. Whereas you can explain why I'm lifting it up. I'm lifting it up to use it as a demonstration in this presentation. So the agent's actions are explainable in terms of mental facts, and that's what Taylor's getting at, I think. So I think he's almost arguing for this multiple realizability thesis, but he's just not quite there. He doesn't quite say it outright, but I think you would probably agree with it if he were to come across it or expand on his writing. Okay, so in conclusion, this presentation gave a general overview of the discourse surrounding determinism, autonomy, free will, and ethics, and I outlined and critiqued Taylor and Ayer's positions, and then I discussed multiple realizability and how it might be used to defend free will in the face of a physically deterministic universe. So even if physical determinism is true, if one adopts multiple realizability, but one acknowledges that, then you have to accept a dualist philosophy, and you have to acknowledge that maybe there are mental facts outside of the physical facts that play a role in explaining the universe. And if one acknowledges this, then that leaves room for free will inside a physically deterministic universe, because while the physical is determined, beings with minds obviously the mentality of those beings can influence their actions outside of physical determinism. So therefore their actions aren't wholly determined by physical causal explanatory factors. So yeah, that's the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I know it went a little over time, so it's just a rush to the end there, but thank you very much.